Guatemalan Indigenous People Fight for Their Place in a Colonized World by me, Carlos Martinez. As you can see, I've included a translation of what it says on this protest sign. It says yes to the approval of constitutional reform. In this presentation, I will be focusing on the Mayan people of Guatemala as they are the overwhelming majority of the indigenous population. First, we'll start with a brief introduction into who the indigenous people of Guatemala are. According to evidence found, since 6500 BC, the Maya people have settled and lived on the land now known as Guatemala. With their own languages, traditions, customs, teachings, and spirituality, they built an extremely rich culture that developed over thousands of years. Through the generational impacts of colonization and the conquest of their land, Guatemalan indigenous people today live in poverty, endure discrimination and oppression, and are marginalized into the fringes of society, even though they make up a large part of the population. Today, Guatemala has the third highest indigenous population in Latin America, only behind Peru and Bolivia. This chart on the slide breaks down the various subgroups inside the Mayan people who make up the 41.7% of the population. First, we'll start by looking at the indigenous women of Guatemala and the struggles they go through. The Mayan women of Guatemala have experienced persecution for many decades. During the Guatemalan Civil War, genocide was committed towards the indigenous population as mass murders, rape, and destruction of communities occurred. During this war, sexual violence was a frequently used tool, and too often it was Mayan women who were the victims. 88% of reported sexual violence during the war was against this group of women. The repercussions are felt to this day as many women suffer psychological trauma that is left undealt with. Some were blamed and rejected by their families and communities, even having to live in the same place as their aggressors, forced to suffer in silence. Many of those who committed these horrifying crimes against the Mayan women avoided punishment and remain in positions of power and leadership today. They work to maintain the status quo of machismo culture in their society, seeking to continue to dominate women and keep them dependent on their current way of life. This status quo has led to the unspoken acceptance of violence against women in a country where the man is expected to be the dominant one in all facets of life. So in indigenous women of childbearing age, we find the highest rate of depression and anxiety in Guatemala. And in recent years, gender-based violence has been on a fast rise, especially in indigenous communities. For indigenous women in Guatemala, two of the most oppressing factors to consider are first, the machismo culture that is so prevalent in a male-dominated society such as this. Secondly, the societal expectations within the society on women, their roles, and rights. In Guatemala, the man is assumed and expected to be the dominant one in a relationship. They make the decisions and they are the breadwinners, so they have control over finances and resources. When it comes to the subject of sex, it is seen as a requirement and something the male must be provided with, while the woman is seen as the provider, giving the appearance that in these close relationships, sexual abuse cannot occur. But we know that's not the case. Conversely, women are expected to accept the traditional housewife-housekeeper role, and those who stray from that are stigmatized and shamed, as the man is always assumed to be right. Indigenous women are paid less and unable to obtain better paying jobs due to the societies imposing these roles on them. Those women who are able to work have their wages taken by partners to maintain their dominance, often leading to an atmosphere of jealousy and insecurity that results in violence. This quote here on the screen is from a social worker working for a nonprofit organization in Guatemala, whose goal was to build empowerment amongst indigenous communities by better education and facilitation of sustainable programs. So Sarah says the woman takes on the blame as her own. In her mind, she becomes the perpetrator rather than the victim, and so she tells no one what's happening to her because she sees it as a personal failure. Today, similar to the experience of indigenous women in Canada, the Mayan women of Guatemala are even more at risk and oppressed due to their gender. In a male-dominated society where it's estimated that 36% of women living with men are subject to intimate partner violence, and femicides go unpunished 98% of the time, these women are subject to extremely poor living conditions. Mayan women suffer from lack of access to good education and often miss out on much of their education at younger ages as they are expected to stay at home to help their mother with housework. Those of them that are abused and have children who witness it experience their children becoming more susceptible to mental or physical problems. Mayan women can be considered triple discriminated against due to their gender on top of race and poverty. In addition, Indigenous women are denied jobs due to society's views on what role they should take on and are made to be financially dependent on their male partners, who often abuse them. Trying to leave a relationship where you depend financially on your attacker is extremely hard, and even if you manage to leave, you have no resources to survive on your own. The graphics shown here show the results of a study performed on Indigenous women in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. The objects closer to the women would be considered important factors impacting their health and well-being, while those further away would be considered less important factors on their well-being and health. As we can see in the rural areas, the factors impacting their health and well-being are mostly tied to their partner, family, and money, or lack thereof. On the urban side of things, we can see that for these women, lack of education and fear of asking of help from strangers has the biggest impact on their health and well-being. Another issue at the forefront for the Mayan people is the one about their rights, looking to have them officially recognized and acknowledged throughout the country. In Latin America throughout the 80s and 90s, indigenous people went through a reframing of individual rights and citizenship. Becoming recognized in more countries, the rights became more collective and the indigenous peoples acquired rights as a whole. In the 1990s, Guatemala joined in ratifying the International Labor Convention 169 concerning the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries. To set up a framework for the collective rights of indigenous people and the obligations their countries would have to them. The rights guaranteed through this convention include equality of opportunity, protections for indigenous peoples' religions and customs, right to ownership and possession of traditionally occupied lands, and rights to appropriate forms of health and education provisions. It also commits governments to recognize the jurisdictional autonomy of indigenous people. Articles 8, 9, and 10 of this convention provide indigenous people with the right to administer their own form of justice as long as they respect the fundamental and internationally recognized human rights. Despite this turnaround, by the 2000s, many Mayan people were disillusioned with their government in Guatemala. Policy changes had been destructive to indigenous ways of life, and their rights, they were still being persecuted and met with force by the state when they were attempting to exercise their rights. They were still being displaced through economic development and remained stuck in poverty. Today, the Mayan people of Guatemala continue to fight to have their right to self-autonomy, self-governance, and land, while continuing to experience extreme poverty, discrimination, and oppression from the state and other communities. They take action through forms of protest, legal proceedings, and activism in an attempt to not only raise awareness, but to get results for their people. Does this sound familiar? We know the Indigenous people of Canada experience the same difficulties today as they take on similar challenges here in our home. We move on to another key fight for the Mayan people of Guatemala. Their desire to have their legal traditions and perspectives be considered not just complementary to the Guatemalan criminal justice system, but on the same level. This is important because it will go a long way in getting their rights officially recognized as well, as indigenous legal language and knowledge is integrated into the standard criminal justice system. The Mayan people find themselves in losing battles in courts because their traditional legal perspectives are seen as having no basis in the current legal system. While international human rights laws are progress, it is at home where they need that progress to be made. Even the term Mayan law is seen as a controversial phrase. This weak standing in the legal system has led to structural, institutionalized, and legal discrimination against the Mayan people. So currently, despite international acts and declarations, indigenous people have no legal right to territorial autonomy in Guatemala, so the state retains all the rights to any resources in the ground. So why is it important for the Mayan people of Guatemala to have their legal traditions and perspectives be recognized and acknowledged? Well, in Guatemala, they have one of the world's most uneven distributions of wealth, with the rich making the majority of the money and owning most of the land. Meanwhile, 80% of indigenous people live in poverty. This is partly due to indigenous people seeing minimal victories in the court systems, where they find themselves behind from the start, losing rulings over valuable resources and land. The Mayan people had an incredibly diverse legal perspective, which was shaped by local needs and history. Mayan law was not something that governed all Mayan people, but was different from group to group. Today, there remains almost no Mayan authorities at the grassroots or municipal levels. Barriers such as this and others such as geographical or linguistic ones limit the access indigenous people have to the state justice system. They are in need of their own system which caters to their specific needs. While Western knowledge has made and continues to make many contributions in different areas, it must be acknowledged that other forms of knowledge are viable, such as indigenous ways of knowing and doing. The different types of knowledge that Guatemalan indigenous people use are connected to their ways of seeing the world, where the relationship between all living beings and with the universe are at the center. Spiritual ancestral knowledge is passed on by spiritual guides, and traditional practices are passed on by elders. The spiritual and practical application of knowledge go hand in hand and relates to their worldview. While their methods may be different, the level of educating and learning is just as high. So where does indigenous knowledge stand in today's modern Guatemala? Guatemalan indigenous leaders contend that indigenous knowledge is science and must be acknowledged as such. Right now, it's not valued or treated like science by the state, which illustrates the divide between knowledges that are respected and those that are ignored and devalued. Mayan leaders and intellectuals say that because they wish to have their forms of knowledge considered equal today, does not mean the current forms of knowledge will be valued any less. Instead, it would demonstrate how these different types of knowing and doing complement each other when working in harmony. Instead of seeing Western knowledges and science as universal, the values of alternatives can be presented to the rest of the country and the nation. Mayan leaders and representatives argue for the usefulness and importance of indigenous knowledge in relation to the failures of the Western system and the current situation we sit in front of right now with climate change and the problems we have with Earth and nature. Perhaps results would be different if different forms of knowledge were applied. They demonstrate the importance of the knowledge that their grandparents have held on to despite discrimination, racism, and genocide and have managed to pass down through the generations. As part of the struggle for the validation of indigenous knowledge and as an effort to move from the other to the widely accepted side, they argue that the knowledge they carry is science and explain their stance. They stress how their forms of indigenous knowledge are complementary to Western views, not in contradiction to them. This way of thought is in line with how important the roles of complementarity and interconnectedness are from a Mayan perspective, and how these concepts demonstrate the compatibility between Mayan traditional knowledge and Western forms of knowledge. Western forms of academia and knowledge need to demonstrate respect for different forms of knowledge. The indigenous people of Guatemala demonstrate that a plural approach of non-hierarchical knowledge production is necessary in the society that contains so many indigenous people, and that they are open to working with Western methods as equals. They see these forms of knowledge and science as complementary to each other. Wrapping up this presentation on the indigenous people of Guatemala, we have looked at three subjects that significantly impact the Mayan indigenous peoples. First, we explored the difficulties that Mayan women endure in modern Guatemala. Mayan women are subject to machismo culture in Guatemala, which refers to the societal expectations for men to be dominant, in control, and always right. Women are expected to accept the role of housewife, and if they don't, they are stigmatized by their communities. The second part looked at the two-headed fight indigenous people are taking on to have both their rights be officially recognized and acknowledged, as well as their legal traditions and perspectives. Similar to indigenous people of Canada, the Guatemalan indigenous people must have their rights be recognized in the legal court system, and in order to gain traction and win more legal battles, Having their legal traditions be acknowledged as equal in the eyes of the law would give them a better chance. The third subject was Indigenous knowledge, why it is a valuable tool that would work well in complement to Western knowledge, and why it should be integrated into modern Guatemalan society. I hope that you have gained valuable new knowledge and understanding from this presentation on some of the important issues that face the Mayan people of Guatemala today and some of the similarities they have with the indigenous people of our country. Thank you.